Good evening, everybody. So I'm Katy Hayward. I'm Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University in Belfast, and I'm also Senior Fellow in UK and a Changing Europe, which is a think tank that's been going a few years now, based in King's. Originally, we focused on Brexit, but it's broadened out to be much more general around social science. I work full-time on the question of the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland, across various dimensions, including public opinion here, including questions of governance, and also on what happens at the Irish border. And I've written a lot on those topics, and obviously I appreciate a lot on the question of the Irish border in particular, and then since the withdrawal agreement, a lot on the protocol. And I work with various groups and bodies across Northern Ireland, the UK, and further afield, in trying to produce evidence that helps inform understanding and indeed policy around what happens here in this really unusual situation in which we found ourselves. So thank you, Gavin, for the invitation to speak to this group, and thank you all for your interest in Northern Ireland, because I appreciate that even though it's been a lot on the news at various times and seems to be very much at the sort of the crux of UK-EU continued tensions, there's often a sort of a limited opportunity that people here get to have to explain the situation as it's being experienced. And that's what I'm hoping to do in my short talk today. So bear with me, I'm going to share some slides, partly because I'm a lecturer and I can't help myself. I was trying to think of what might be most useful for you in thinking about what is needing to be known around the situation here in Northern Ireland after Brexit and the protocol. So I will just run through these fairly quickly. And at the end, I'm very happy to take any questions at all on any matters relating to this or more broadly in relation to Northern Ireland after Brexit and the protocol. So please feel free to start those questions. I'll be glad to talk them through with you. So the first thing is, why do we have the protocol? And just to put it as simply as possible, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of how we came to this point, not necessarily in terms of the process, but in terms of the principle, and why it is that we have such an unusual situation as Northern Ireland is experiencing now, with the fact that we have border checks and controls now between Britain and Northern Ireland. I do a lot of work on borders. In the past, I used to do work on the impact of European integration on borders, particularly the Irish border. And now, of course, I'm doing that rather in reverse. And I like this little image from Bloomberg, which was drawn up at the beginning of Brexit, and it sort of helps explain the situation for the UK and indeed the complexity within the EU that already existed. Obviously, as you well understand, there are different levels and degrees of integration. And even though the UK was within the EU, as was Ireland, it was outside the Schengen area in terms of the movement of people, immigration rules, as was Ireland, but it was also outside the Eurozone. Ireland, of course, is inside the Eurozone. And one way of thinking about the impact that European integration has on borders is that the more involved you are, the softer those borders get. So those at the very heart there inside the Eurozone, etc., they're experiencing the minimal disruption, the minimal need for border checks and controls between those member states. When you begin to get outside of those lines, you begin to get more checks and controls. In a sense, what border management means is that you need to know what's entering the country. You need to know that it meets the criteria for entry, and that if it doesn't, you have to be able to stop it. And this is true not just in relation to customs, which is about the payment of tariffs, i.e. if you're outside the customs union, you need to pay the EU's external tariff, but also in relation to regulation. And that's where the nitty-gritty of things comes in, and particularly the complexity around the protocol. Checks and controls are needed to make sure that things meet the standards for sale in a particular country, and those checks and controls can be fairly rigorous, particularly so on things that are highly regulated, such as agri-food. So there was a shared priority right from the beginning. After the Brexit referendum, Northern Ireland, of course, voted 56% to remain, but the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, had campaigned to leave. And it was quite difficult at the beginning then to get a common Northern Ireland executive position, bearing in mind that Northern Ireland's executive is made up of 5 parties. It's a power-sharing executive, a mandatory coalition. It was difficult to get them to come to a particular point where they agreed on what needed to be prioritised in the UK's withdrawal negotiations. However, they did agree that the importance of the land border with the EU shouldn't be overlooked in the UK's negotiations. And it said, they wrote a letter to Theresa May, and they said, we've had a troubled history, as you know, in relation to the border, and this unique position of the Irish land border needs to be borne in mind. The Prime Minister's reply was very clear, saying we wish to see the continuance of the free movement of people and goods across the island of Ireland. Now, free movement, of course, has a particularly loaded term. We know what that means in the context of European integration. It's more than just movement without restriction. A lot of European integration, the development of the single market, has been about adding layers of common legislation so that goods can easily be sold in the other jurisdiction as if they were made on the other side of the border. The EU Council, in no small part influenced by the efforts of the Irish government and Irish diplomats, recognised the importance of this land border as well. The EU's external border being on the island of Ireland was going to create difficulties. And so in their guidelines on the Article 50 negotiations, they did say flexible and imaginative solutions will be required in view of the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, including, as they say, with the aim of avoiding a hard border while respecting the integrity of the union legal order. That remains the nub of the challenge. And that challenge, and you may have seen this diagram by R.Dan Keleman before, but that challenge is really provoked by the UK's decision to have a hard Brexit. And we're seeing this now on Britain's borders with the EU, now that the UK government is beginning to enforce border controls on incoming goods, as well as experiencing them on outgoing goods. So that is, if you're leaving the means by which goods can flow easily across borders, i.e. single market and customs union, that requires a border to be had. And either, as this puts it, either you have that across the island of Ireland, or you have it down the Irish Sea, or if you don't want to have those border controls either in the island of Ireland or down the Irish Sea, then you stay in the single market customs union. So that's the dilemma, and an awful lot of effort and energy and evidence was put forward during the withdrawal negotiations to try and explain why having a hard border, i.e. checks and controls, physical infrastructure on the island of Ireland would be highly problematic. I won't go into the details of that, but I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A. So what is the protocol? What did they come up with in the end? And there were a number of versions of the protocol before Boris Johnson negotiated the withdrawal agreement in October 2019, the protocol being a part of that. Importantly, the protocol's objectives are to address the unique circumstances on the island, to maintain the conditions for North-South cooperation, which is a really important part of the peace process, and economic development on the island. It's to avoid a hard border and protect the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in all its dimensions. Interestingly, at the very top of the protocol is the statement that it's without prejudice to the provisions of that Good Friday Belfast Agreement, particularly with regards to Northern Ireland's constitutional status, which is to say that Northern Ireland will remain in the UK until such a time as the majority of people vote for it to become part of United Ireland. So that was meant to reassure Unionists about the implications of the protocol. And this is what the protocol contains. It's not a long document if you just take the actual text, but if you then add the annexes, it becomes much longer because, as you might not be surprised to hear, the devil is in the detail. I will just highlight a couple of things that are worth bearing in mind that often aren't thought of. The first is Article 2, which is really very, very important for the protocol. And this is basically to commit the UK government to non-diminution of the rights, safeguards, and equality of opportunity that individuals in Northern Ireland enjoy as a part of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. So that's underpinned by the European Convention on Human Rights, and with it, therefore, the European Court of Human Rights. They have set up dedicated mechanism to make sure that these rights are not diminished. Human rights, of course, being a fundamental part of the transformation of Northern Ireland and the peace process that was forged through the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. Another aspect of the protocol that you won't hear about very much in Britain is North-South cooperation. So again, as I mentioned, it's part of the objectives of the protocol, and they have an article in which the UK and the EU are committed to maintaining the conditions for North-South cooperation, which covers such a wide range of areas. It's way more than trade. Is relating to agriculture, transport, education, health provision, etc. And then we come to the nub of it and the heavyweight impact of the protocol, Articles 5 to 10, including the single electricity market that exists on the island. This is, as I say, where the nub of it is, and with Article 5, even though Article 4 confirms that Northern Ireland is in the customs territory of the UK. Article 5 means that the EU's customs code is applied on goods moving from GB into Northern Ireland. Just one little thing to note that is really important. One thing that Boris Johnson negotiated that wasn't there in the previous version of the protocol that Theresa May had put forward is the fact that MLAs from Northern Ireland will get to vote in the first instance at the end of 2024 on whether they want to see the continued application of Articles 5 to 10. So that vote was paraded by Boris Johnson as being a sign that the people of Northern Ireland have a democratic say over the protocol. But what will happen, and I won't go into the details, but again, I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested. If the majority of MLAs vote against Articles 5 to 10, their continued application, then we have that Irish border question right back on the table again. And it's up to the UK and the EU to, over the course of 2 years, come up with an alternative, i.e. to try and manage that border trilemma, that I showed you earlier. After the 2 years, that will then apply. And we'll see where that goes. Just in very simple terms, it's probably worth noting that the protocol is viewed as somewhat problematic by the two sides, and this could be perfectly expected to be the case because both of them accommodated and stretched in drawing up the protocol, as is necessary by such a unique situation as Northern Ireland. Britain and Ireland stretched and accommodated the other in coming up with the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and the UK and EU have done the same with the protocol. So from the EU's point of view, they think Northern Ireland's doing jolly well because it has free access to the single market for goods, even though it's outside of the EU. It also is very conscious of the fact it's trusting the UK to enforce the rules. The EU isn't here in the border. Well, if they were built, it's not at the border control posts. It's not in the ports and airports. In the form of customs agents enforcing these rules. It's trusting the UK authorities to do that. And it also believes that the risk to its single market, the legal integrity of its union, that risk grows over time, most particularly if the rules and controls aren't properly enforced. So that's where it's coming from. From the UK point of view, particularly from a government that wants to see a hard Brexit and very apparent divergence from EU rules, as we've seen recently with the Brexit Opportunities document. The protocol sits uncomfortably because, in essence, it means that the UK remains tied to EU rules in certain ways, including on state aid. Also, the UK's point of view is that customs procedures occurring on internal UK movement of goods means disruption to supply chains and a threat to the UK's internal market. And it sees that the more these rules and controls are enforced and strictly then that risk grows over time. And in effect, this puts Northern Ireland in an increasingly distinct position within the UK. So that's the context. What's been the impact? Well, you remember the headlines that were grabbed in April last year around protests that were happening around the protocol. They stopped actually after less than a week, or at least the violent ones did, or the more disruptive ones did, primarily, believe it or not, because of Prince Philip's funeral. That's when the protests began to stop, and that kind of stopped the momentum behind them at the time. But the political disruption has been very significant. And I would say that it's the political disruption of the protocol, but also, of course, the political disruption that's been caused by Brexit in and of itself to the conditions of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, in the changed relationships that now exist between Britain and Ireland, who guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. They're foundational to it, north-south on the island, and then between unionists and nationalists. Just to give you a little bit of an example, or a sense rather, of what's been experienced across different sectors, my colleague, Professor David Finnemore, and I, together with Dr. Lisa Claire Witten, have been conducting stakeholder workshops. We just recently had the third round there for a post-Brexit governance project here. And you can see that when we were asking different sectors about the way that the protocol has been experienced, there's a bit of a mix. It's very difficult to differentiate between the impact of the protocol and impact of Brexit. To put it simply, whether the protocol is having a negative or a positive impact very much depends on the nature of your business. So, for example, there are some businesses who are doing very well indeed out of Brexit, out of the protocol. So if they are producing goods here locally that are then bought by companies here who've swapped from sourcing from GB, they're doing very well. Also, those companies that export to the EU, they're doing better than their GB counterparts. Similarly, those who source from the EU. However, those who source from Britain or even get their goods from the EU but via Britain have been experiencing difficulties. And it is worth noting that the protocol hasn't yet been fully enforced. So we are in the state of a certain number of grace periods, particularly in relation to agri-food products. Those grace periods have come about. They were negotiated at the end of 2020, but they've been extended, as you know, in some cases unilaterally by the UK government, and in others on the basis of agreement. If they were to end tomorrow, we would see much more significant disruption from the protocol, and we'd see many more empty shelves here in the way that there has been seen in Britain in some cases, as a result of the new border checks and controls between GB and the EU. You can see there's a lot of detail, and the concerns existing around Brexit and the protocol are not confined to business by any means. they have a knock-on effect in relation to Labour, a knock-on effect in relation to concerns about the protection of human rights. And a big issue that's constantly raised is a sense of concern around Northern Ireland's voice being heard in all of this. We do regular polling as part of that project. We've actually just conducted a poll there this past weekend, but we haven't got the results processed yet. So unfortunately, I'll just give you the ones that are the most recent we have from the autumn, late October. And from this, you can see the picture is more nuanced and different from the one that the impression that may often be given in some press, and indeed in the House of Commons sometimes, the House of Lords. There are grave concerns around the political stability of Northern Ireland, partly in relation to those protests, but more generally in relation to where those protests come from, i.e. unionist concerns, which I'll mention in a moment. But there are views around the impact of the protocol as having a positive effect on the economy of Northern Ireland. And we ask these same questions in every poll, and the impact, the views, positive views around the impact of the protocol on the economy have grown over the course of the first year of its implementation. We see here generally negative views around the impact of the protocol on Northern Ireland's place in the UK Constitution and in the UK internal market. But views on whether it protects the Good Friday Belfast Agreement tend to be much more positive. If you look in more detail at this data, it's very clear that those who are unionists generally think that it's having a negative effect on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Those who are nationalist and the other is a really important community here, think that it's having a positive impact. Also, similarly, the same pattern on Northern Ireland's position in the world. And then just last but not least, the impact of the protocol on North-South cooperation is generally seen as positive, possibly not surprising given that we have managed to avoid a hard border for the movement of goods, but we do have a hard border in other ways, for example, for the movement of services. But generally speaking, it's seen as good for that. However, it's seen as being negative for British-Irish relations, and we don't need to look very far for examples of tension in that relationship, and also seen as negative for UK-EU relations, and in no small way connected to the negative British-Irish relationship or the tensions in that relationship now. We see a knock-on effect in negative UK-EU relations over the protocol, even though Liz Truss has a seemingly much more warm relationship with Maroš Šefčovič than her predecessor, Lord Frost. This is a breakdown of possibly the key question that we have asked in our polling, i.e. is the protocol on balance a good thing? And this will help explain why it is that we're having the reaction we are in the political sphere around the protocol. So you can see here that those who are strongly unionist, so they would be DUP supporters for the most part, and even to the harder line to the right of them, the traditional unionist voice, very strongly of the view that the protocol is on balance a bad thing. And that polling hasn't changed since we first conducted it in March. Generally, that's been the pattern. Those who are strongly unionist think it's a bad thing. Those who are slightly unionist, now this is self-described, that call themselves slightly unionist, but they would be generally Ulster Unionist Party supporters. We see there's more variation here. So yes, over half think it's a negative thing, but we also see some softer unionists who think it's a positive thing, and others who are undecided. So the pattern's a bit more mixed there. And then looking at the neithers, so the neither unionist nor nationalist, these would be some degree Alliance Party supporters or Green Party supporters, or indeed they don't vote necessarily, very strongly pro-Remain. They think that the protocol is on balance good. The majority of them think that, and that grew significantly from June in terms of the strength of agreement on this. Similarly, amongst nationalists, you can see here, if it's possible to read, how much I'm trying to show here that that grew between June and October, and that's partly possibly because of the negative headlines in Britain at the time around the impact that Brexit was having on particularly on availability of goods. So you can see here, nationalists very much of the view that the protocol is a good thing. Hardline unionists very much of the view it's a bad thing. Those who are soft unionists, small variation in opinion. I just wanted to touch on the question of why we're having the reaction that we are amongst unionists, which is obviously having very direct consequences on the political situation here. And this is from different source of polling. So this is a Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, which is like the British Social Attitude Survey. And since 2016, we've been asking the question of whether people think Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. You can see from this polling, or from this survey work, that in 2016, if we look at the unionists first and foremost, the clear majority of them thought that Brexit made no difference to the possibility of a United Ireland or the likelihood of it. However, that significantly changed after the protocol to a situation where we have the plurality of unionists now thinking that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. So if you appreciate what unionism is all about, if they think that Brexit and the way that Brexit has worked out, including the protocol, makes United Ireland more likely, you can understand their position at the moment. Those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, even more strongly of the view post-protocol that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely, and nationalists have been of that view since 2017. But of course, it's not just about whether you think United Ireland is more likely, it's whether you are more likely to support a United Ireland. Because if the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland thinks that there's likely to be a majority in favour of Irish unity, then he's obliged to call a referendum on it. Unionists, unsurprisingly, haven't become more in favour, with the exception of just a few percentage, more in favour of a United Ireland as a result of Brexit. Indeed, what we've seen is an increase since the protocol of those saying they're less in favour, so more strongly against Irish unity. Those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, we've seen a huge rise since 2018, but most particularly since the protocol, of those who are saying they are more in favour of Irish unity. Now, as I mentioned, the vast majority of neithers, particularly Alliance Party supporters, very strongly pro-Remain. So this is possibly reflected here in this change, but I think that's really striking. And then nationalists increasingly in favour, or strongly in favour of Irish unity. So that helps explain the context in which unionists are trying to imagine Northern Ireland's future post-Brexit, post-protocol, and the changed environment within which the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive have to operate. So last week, seems a very long time ago, but it was just last week, that we had the DUP's Minister for Agriculture. So there's a lot of background to this, but essentially he came out on Wednesday last and ordered that department officials stop stop checks on agri-food products coming into Northern Ireland from Britain. There was an awful lot of flurry around wondering what this meant, but immediately there was a legal case taken, and for the time being, officials are continuing on with the checks because there is a sense that the protocol was, this order by Minister Poots was illegal. And then the next day, Paul Givan, the DUP First Minister, resigned from his position. And even though he didn't mention Edwin Poots, and he didn't go into much detail around his reasons for resigning, it's very clear that the DUP are basically saying that they won't come back into power sharing until the protocol issues are resolved. This wasn't a surprise. There was some suggestion from some Number 10 spokesperson that this came as a surprise, but it really didn't. Paul Given and the DP first made this threat to withdraw from the executive back in September last. And as I say, it looks as though they won't come back in until the protocol is resolved. The big question of that is, well, what does resolved look like in order to reassure unionists? So my last slide, looking ahead, we've had another meeting today between Liz Truss and Mar Shefkovich, and they've got a joint committee meeting. So that'll be like the formal meeting between them. That's happening on the 21st of February. And that will be a very significant meeting if we can see that the talks that have been ongoing between them to try and resolve the technical issues around the protocol can actually be successful. But I think in all of this, and just to conclude, what needs to be borne in mind, particularly by the UK government at this time, is first and foremost that this is about a relationship between the UK and the EU. So for as long as there'll be a protocol, as long as there's a treaty basis for the UK relationship, they will be integrally connected to one another over what happens here in Northern Ireland and over the protocol. And that relationship, if it's a bad one or if it's a good one, will have a direct effect on the conditions of peace in Northern Ireland. Another thing to bear in mind is that the UK government isn't just responsible for unionists. We've seen a much more overtly unionist positioning by the UK government. This began, you might say, with Theresa May and the confidence and supply arrangement that she came up with in order to form a government with the DUP, offering the supply, in theory anyway, of votes on critical when it came to the withdrawal agreement in the House of Commons, even though they didn't deliver that in the end. But actually, since that point, we've seen explicitly pro-unionist positioning from the UK government, which it isn't prevented from doing by any means, but it does need to recognise that, of course, it's not just there to represent unionists, it is also, the UK is also the government of Northern Ireland as a whole, including nationalists and others, and the majority of whom were pro-Remain, and this is going to be difficult. The situation here isn't going to be improved, particularly nationalists' wish for United Ireland isn't going to be mitigated by any means with this kind of language from the UK government. So that needs to be borne in mind, not least because the Good Friday Agreement states the legitimacy of nationalist aspirations as much as unionist. Thirdly, the protocol and the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is not the primary concern for most people, and we've had other polls recently which have sort of underlined this point. As you might expect, other matters, particularly with respect to the healthcare crisis here at the moment and the growing cost of living crisis, those are matters that do concern people. However, because of that democratic consent vote at the end of 2024, there does seem to be a situation in which the protocol is being written into domestic politics here in a way that it might not otherwise be. And we expect the Assembly election, which is currently due to be held on the 5th of May, to be very much dominated by the protocol as a topic for debate, which means we're expecting it to be quite intense and quite even more bruising than normal, actually. And then last but not least, even though the UK is looking for technical solutions and movement from the EU, it almost goes without saying that a lot of the challenge for the Irish Sea border comes from the fact that the UK wishes to have that hard Brexit and diverge from the EU. And because Northern Ireland is in many ways between Britain and Ireland, between Britain and the EU, Northern Ireland's position does become more precarious in many ways, the more divergence there is between the two of them. And the protocol makes it complicated in that Northern Ireland is following certain part of the EU acquis. Of course, as I say, there is an explicit wish part of the UK government to diverge from that. So it'll become more complicated over time. And this precariousness is exacerbated by the fact that the three strands of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, i.e. the relationship between Britain and Ireland, North, South, and the island of Ireland, and Unionist, Nationalist, is those two strands are very much disrupted by Brexit for all sorts of reasons. And until we find stability in the UK-EU relationship, those three strands will continue to become more and more stretched and more tense, which will only put the peace process here under greater pressure. Thank you.